All right, hello. Welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I realize I haven't been introducing us for the last couple of episodes, so I am Derick, one of your hosts, and with me is my brother Evan. Hello.
Hey, how we doing?
This episode, by the way, there is a third member involved. A fly has entered my room. It is very loud and very annoying, and if you see me just swinging wildly at something, for those of you watching a video version of this, that is what that is. And yeah, if the computer goes down, understand it was in a noble cause. Um,
We'll
as
be
we try to,
prepared.
yeah, exterminate the life of this thing. And it's massive too. It's like
Be
a,
advised.
like a bus flying through the room.
One of the
All right.
benefits of Colorado is it's pretty dry out here, and they just
Is
don't
it?
have a lot of bugs. It's weird.
I gotta move west.
Right?
Gotta do that. But all right, so today, yeah, if last episode was veering into the semi-controversial, today we'll lay the groundwork for how some of our analysis may be viewed as, yeah, outside of the mainstream. Today we're going to talk about how we are going to look at the Bible through a symbolic lens as well. Okay, so symbolism is something that I feel like the Protestant church has a bit of an allergy towards. I don't know if that's your experience as well, but it feels to me like a lot of times the Protestant church has three symbols, which are baptism and the Lord's Supper, and then the resurrection of Christ. And everything else in the Bible is like a symbolism relating to those things. And I think there is much more than that going on in the Bible. And for instance,
Well,
go ahead.
well, that's something that happens when I mean, Protestantism was a reaction to something. And so
Right.
when you're reacting to something, it's very, very, very difficult to not overreact to it.
Yes.
And so one of the things that obviously Protestantism for the past 500 years has been reacting to is the potential overuse of symbols in the Catholic Church, or
Reliance on it.
the over reliance on it, or the distance, even more so probably the distance from practicality in faith, or from directness of faith.
Right.
And so the everything that was seemed to be hiding behind a veil of symbolism, or hiding behind a veil of pomp and circumstance that is in Catholicism. And these aren't critiques right now. This is just more so just stating what Catholicism is versus Protestantism in most cases, is going to be kind of thrown out, and they're going to try and avoid that at all costs. This is why you see from the intricate, intricate cathedral all the way to the very, very shabby church house being what things like John Calvin is advocating for. The very, very plain place of worship and stuff like that. Of course,
Yes.
they're trying to get rid of that.
I couldn't disagree with him more on that, by the way. But
Well, agreed. And I think again, it's throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and getting rid of something that really is important to the way in which we view the Bible. That doesn't mean the reaction shouldn't have happened, but it does mean it should be amended.
yeah, it maybe went too far.
Exactly.
And I'll give an example of this in a minute, but first I want to mention that I am pulling quite a bit just in the way I'm talking about this from this book here. It's The Language of Creation. I'll have a link in the bottom by a guy named Matthew Pageot. It's spelled in the French way of spelling Matthew because he's French Canadian. But he actually, I think, is in the Orthodox Church. But I think it's some of the best ways of trying to describe what symbolism really is, and I think it's very good at doing that. So it's worth checking out that book, and we'll borrow a little bit from his way of framing things here. But the first thing I want to say is that a symbol, and I think this related to the way he describes it in there, I think this is really good, is a fact of nature, or a fact of reality, or a fact within a story, or something that represents a higher meaning, a cosmic meaning, a spiritual meaning. And the reason we use symbols is to convey abstract concepts with concrete examples. But we're not describing concrete ideas, they're abstract ideas. And that actually is part of, I think, the Protestant difficulty with symbols, is that it's founded upon a very concrete idea, right? That salvation is this individual thing, and that you personally can go to God and seek salvation, and we rightfully treat that as a very concrete thing. And so because you're dealing with a very concrete thing there's kind of an aversion to really getting into the abstractions, or every abstraction is sort of seen as relating to that one concrete thing. And that, I think, is a bit of a mistake. So as an example, we actually will have put this out by now as sort of a bonus episode. You and I have talked about a painting you saw of Adam and Eve, right? And
I believe it was a chair.
Oh, a chair. Yeah.
It was like
it was a representation of Adam and Eve. Yeah. And you said that the serpent had been replaced with the dragon, right? And that, I think, is important in a symbolic sense, because for early man, there was no more terrifying reality than the serpent. You're walking through the grass and you come across, this thing that you can't see because it's hides among the grass and debris on the ground. It's very hard for you to spot, even though humans have a lot better eyesight than a lot of other animals. It's still very hard for us to spot, and it can strike at a moment's notice. It was sort of the peak threat, the peak danger, the peak opponent of mankind that exists.
If I'm remembering correctly, that the human vision has been selected to be more more acute in the lower half, in order to see the things that are down on the ground, and to be able to be aware of what snakes, really. That's the only thing that could be down there. I mean, we don't care about mice or anything like that, so that's the main thing that we're concerned with.
Yes. And so that's important to understand the symbolism of that, and that changing the serpent and replacing it with a dragon in that image is an example of changing the symbol to maintain the same meaning, right? Because in that kind of time, there's an idea of the dragon as this prime threat to humanity, the most dangerous thing that humanity can face, the biggest obstacle in front of it. And so I liked the idea of changing up that image in that chair or whatever it was that had this image built into it, because it was maintaining the spiritual truth with a different symbol, right? Because for our modern day sensibilities, a snake is not really the great threat anymore. A snake is, for the most part, something we don't come into contact with, or if we do, it's usually not the super dangerous kind, except if you live in certain places. So yeah, it's not that prime threat, but the dragon obviously updates that prime threat. I don't know what it is for modern humanity. If it's a nuclear warhead, if you were to make that painting, right? What do you put in there now? I don't know, but that is the kind of
nuke.
That is the kind of symbolism that I don't know that you're going to get necessarily disagreement with from a Protestant per se. Although there's an insistence upon looking at a story like Adam and Eve as being literally true, whereas to me, what matters is that it is symbolically true, right? It may have been literally true as well, but all that really matters is the symbolic truth of it. And that's where I think the Protestant misses it, because if you're going to hear this being discussed in church, you're probably not going to learn about the importance of snakes as a threat to ancient man. That doesn't really come up. But without understanding that symbolism, and you're avoiding the symbolism, I think, at times because you're so focused on the material truth of it. Without understanding that symbolism, I don't think you really understand the significance of what's happening in that moment with Adam and Eve, right? You're not understanding the significance of the threat that is present at that moment unless you understand the symbolism of the serpent.
I have a further example of this. I
Please.
think I've heard of translators of the Bible running into this when translating Christ as the bread of life, especially for cultures where bread isn't a staple. And so I've heard, and I'm speaking from memory here, so I don't know if this is correct, but I've heard that some translations have translated Christ as being the yam of life, because the yam was the staple, and that conveys the symbol far better to the people than it does as the bread of life.
That makes sense.
And so that's accepting fully that it's the bread of life. And I don't think, maybe some people, but I don't think there's many people who would have an issue with that, and understanding that so much of the Bible is drenched in things like that idea expands beyond it. You know, we don't think of Christ referring to himself as bread, except actually with the transubstantiation and consubstantiation for debate, that does become an issue. But we won't go into that right now. But for the most part, we tend to be comfortable with viewing those things as being symbolic, as being communion, as being the symbolic act.
Right.
But
it all still relates back then again to the concrete death and resurrection of Christ, you know?
Correct,
and so that's where I think for the Protestant, like every symbol eventually must relate back to that. Whereas I think there's more going on in the Bible there in terms of the symbols, and we'll deal with that a lot, getting right in here into Genesis 1. I think there's a lot, once we get into that's symbolically going on in terms of the order of creation and why this happens when, and what that reveals, and that you know, it is this abstract sort of cosmic meaning that is being shared with us. And one of the things that I think is important is the idea that there's many different symbols to represent the same idea. And that's important because abstract concepts, we can try and talk about them here, you know, and try and pull out somewhat what they are. But at best, we're just getting a slightly clearer picture. We can't perfectly describe it, right? Because it's abstract. But we can get, you know, a little bit of a clearer idea. And the more symbols we have pointing at that same thing, the more clear of an idea we'll get of that thing. And it's where almost actually the Protestant approach kind of fails, right? Because if you have an abstraction, if symbols are these things meant to point to an abstraction, and you keep having them point at this concrete thing, you're misunderstanding symbolism, right? Like it's meant to point to an abstraction, not a concrete thing. So yeah, and one of the ways in which we have this sort of plurality of symbols is the fact, I look at it this way, is the fact that God reveals himself to us through a Trinity, right? Because he is so vast and so beyond our capacity to understand, that one of the ways he can show us multiple aspects of who he is using the symbolism of a Trinity of himself, rather than just one, you know, version of himself. So yeah, and then one other small point here to hit is the idea of a microcosm. Symbols are or there can be stories that are symbolic, that are microcosms, which that is basically I'm going to use actually Pageau's definition here, which is a miniature representation of the cosmos, right? So that throughout the universe, there's these smaller things that represent to us the idea of something happening on a much larger or grander scale. Within the universe or as a whole. And one of the ways we can see that, and this is going to a material example, is the idea of fractals, right? The most famous sequence of fractals being the Fibonacci sequence, right? People, if you're not familiar with that, look it up, it's worthwhile. It's a pattern we see repeated over and over and over in
Yeah.
nature at a micro level and at a macro level, right?
Yeah.
It's in small microorganisms. It's in like universe level um, uh, representations, and
Yeah.
it's a pattern we see over and over.
Yeah.
And so I think we see that same thing. That's a material sense, right? I think it makes sense when we think of the idea of a microcosm to see that same kind of fractal nature in the functional and spiritual as well.
Are you purposefully emphasizing in represent
Yes.
as
Yeah.
represent?
Representing. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you expand on that? What do you mean?
It's another thing I got from that book that I saw, and I was like, that's perfect, because represent we think of as um and he didn't explain it in there. I just observed that he was doing re-present. Represent is the idea of something is meant to it is not this thing, it's meant to symbolize this thing, right? It's meant to
Yeah.
stand for this
Yeah.
thing, right? It's if someone is a representative of you, it's
Yeah.
not you. It's just meant
They're
to
acting in
stand in your
place.
place, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Representing is the idea that no, this is the same thing occurring over and over and over, right? So the Fibonacci sequence represents itself at all these
Interesting.
different levels
Interesting.
of the way you look at reality.
This feels like this connects a lot to our conversation on narrative, because we talked about how, well, actually, I don't know if I'm recalling that correctly. We'll say we talked about it. Maybe we did, maybe we didn't.
Yeah.
But that narrative, a lot of times, it's so significant for understanding because it shows the way in which something interacts with the world. So let's talk about the idea of, you could talk about the concept of love. Well, that's an abstract concept. Or you could tell a story of love, of a representation of love, and that is going to have more potency. And there can be a variety of different love stories that are very different because of the circumstances in which they present themselves. So you have a this is the second time I'm going to reference Tale of Two Cities, but you have a Tale of Two Cities, at least in the show, you have Tale of Two Cities, which demonstrates love as being dying for someone and going in place. And that's what the image of love is. But conceivably, in a different setting, love doesn't look like dying for the person. It's not required, or that's not how the idea is going to interact.
That's not the way it would be expressed in that dynamic.
Exactly. So as we're talking about this, I can't help but come back to narrative and keep thinking about how narrative is so important here, because it shows how the abstraction interacts with that. And that's why we attach symbolic meanings to different things.
Right. So to give an example, I guess, of the kind of symbolism we'll take forward, and it'll be a while until we get here, but the kind that is not familiar to the Protestant, let's say, is when we get to Adam and Eve and we get to man and woman, the way we'll talk about it here is the idea that really represents not men and women, but the difference between the masculine instinct and the feminine instinct, and that those are things that we all have within us. Now, typically men have a higher ratio of masculine instinct to feminine instinct, right? But within the story, what we're looking at is kind of the peer influence of one versus the other, and that's symbolically represented through a man and a woman. But what we're really looking at is this masculine instinct and feminine instinct, and the way they work and are meant to interact with the world and God's creation, and the way they influence us towards sin and all of those things. So that is an example of the symbolism that we'll be pulling out of there, that is unfamiliar, I guess, to Protestant approaches. And maybe even that particular one, the Catholic or Orthodox wouldn't be familiar with either. I think the idea behind it, they would be more comfortable with. And it is much more consistent with ancient narratives, right? It's much more consistent with the way it would have been interpreted in the time that it was produced and it was written. It's just not something we are as familiar with today. And this goes to that material idea, right? I think we're not as familiar with the symbolism today because we are a more materially focused society. We're more obsessed with this, what can be proven and taken as concrete and all of that. And so that's part of why we don't see this. But that at least gives people an idea of what I'm sort of talking about when I say we're going to take a little more of a symbolic approach here.
If I can go just a little bit along with that, I don't want to go into analyzing the Adam and Eve story yet, but I do want to say that I think lacking the symbolic perspective is one of the things that has gotten the church into so much trouble over centuries, really, because if it is a big difference to say this is what Eve is a representation of absolute femininity, and Adam might be a representation of absolute, or even take absolute out of it. Take just say femininity and masculinity is different than saying Eve is a representation of women and Adam is a representation of men, because suddenly then you run into the interpretations that have been written that would say, see, Eve demonstrates that women fail in this.
Yes.
Or, and maybe the more progressive, interpreter might say, well, Eve represents that, but then Adam represents the way in which men fail. And taking both of those out and saying, well, men and women isn't the issue here. This is the way in which femininity might run into problems, and the way in which masculinity might run into problems, or have positive attributes as well.
Yes.
That's an entirely different conversation, because no longer are we finding our identity in our gender. We're finding our identity in Christ, and knowing that masculinity and femininity are two characteristics that are at play within our world.
They're both at play within us, right?
Exactly.
And that is, frankly, that's symbolized by Eve being created in that story with the rib being pulled out from Adam.
Exactly.
There's still one. That is the point. There's this feminine and this masculine that are still one within us. So so that's the kind of thing we'll be doing here. That's a little bit different than you might be familiar with, depending on where you're coming from. But yeah, all of the implications of what does the Adam and Eve story mean based on that. So if you're interested in that, be sure to follow, subscribe, like, all that kind of stuff, and we'll be back soon.